Welcome, everyone, to the second annual John Cardinal Foley Lecture Series. We are glad that Mother Nature is permitting us to have it tonight, because it was supposed to be back in January. I appreciate your patience with the weather. Apparently, the fog has caused massive traffic jams, so we were a little bit delayed tonight. But we're going to begin this evening with an opening prayer, and to lead us in that, I invite the Rector of Saint Charles Borromeo Seminary, Bishop Timothy Sr.
Thank you, Father Daly, and good evening, everyone. Just remember the presence of God with us now as we pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks for all of your blessings. In your marvelous plan for our salvation, you have revealed yourself to us and entrusted us, even though we are so weak, with the treasure of the gospel, and have called us to proclaim its message in every age to the ends of the earth. And you inspire us to place the talents and gifts that you have given us at the service of that proclamation. We thank you for the witness and the challenging example of Pope Francis, for his call to become missionary disciples in a church that is permanently on mission. We thank you for the inspiration of our beloved Cardinal John Foley, whose memory we revere. For John Allen, and for others who speak so articulately to our world about the life and mission of your church, and for Saint Charles Borromeo Seminary. Bless our gathering this evening, and bless all that we do. Please awaken in us your call to proclaim the gospel in our words and in our actions. Enkindle the flame of desire to seek ever more innovative and creative ways of reaching all people in our time with the message of your love and mercy, the joy of the gospel. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Bishop Sr. Once again, welcome to everyone. As I mentioned, this is the second annual lecture in the series. The series was inaugurated last year in conjunction with the establishment of the John Cardinal Foley Chair of Homiletics and Social Communications here at Saint Charles Borromeo Seminary. For those of you who may not have known him or known of him, Cardinal Foley was a graduate of this seminary, where he also taught philosophy for 17 years. But his greatest service to the church is the realm of media and communications. Following a distinguished career here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia as editor of the Catholic Standard and Times, and nationally as the news secretary for the U.S. Conference of Bishops, he was called to Rome to preside over the international work of what is now the Pontifical Council for Social Communications. Under his leadership, that council produced significant documents and work that brought ethical reflection to bear upon communications, advertising, and a brand new thing at the time called the Internet. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI created him a cardinal and appointed him as Grand Master of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Cardinal Foley returned here to Philadelphia and died here in his native home in 2011. Tonight's lecturer once described Cardinal Foley as the nicest guy in the Vatican. And he says he meant it. Later, he described what made the cardinal so remarkable. In his words, few figures have ever succeeded at putting a human face on the leadership of the institutional church as well as John Foley. Well, tonight we are fortunate to have with us, as a lecturer in Cardinal Foley's honor, a man who might well be the figure who puts the best journalistic face on the church. According to esteemed colleagues in the media, he is, and I quote, the journalist other reporters, and not a few cardinals, look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men direct the world's largest church. Having worked for 2 decades as a senior Vatican analyst for CNN and correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, he is now an associate editor for the Boston Globe, where he spearheads the work of Crux, an online news portal that provides specialized coverage of the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Our lecturer this evening has also written 11 books in this field, the latest of which was just released last week. It's called The Francis Miracle: Inside the Transformation of the Pope and the Church. His core argument is that Pope Francis is a man on a mission, to use his words, to be a change agent, a historic reformer, whose programmatic vision is fully committed to the more than 2,000-year-old faith of the Catholic Church and equally committed to cajoling the Church into a deeper and more positive dialogue with the world around it. Given his own commitment to the professional ideals of journalism and his unique perspective from inside the Church, we are delighted to have him share his viewpoints with us here this evening. So please join me in welcoming the 2015 John Cardinal Foley Lecturer, Mr. John Allen, Jr.
Hello there. Hello, Philadelphia. Come on. Hi. Listen, I know it is pro forma in situations like this for speakers to begin by declaring how delighted they are to be wherever it is they are. And the truth of it is that those of us who spend a lot of time in the lecture circuit, usually we wake up in anonymous hotel rooms, not even clear what city we're in, maybe even what continent we're on in a given day. But today I can tell you for sure, I am not only delighted, but I am honored to be here tonight. And that is for 2 reasons. Actually, it has to do with my personal connections with 2 people who were central to tonight's event, even though, alas, neither one of them is actually in the room with us here tonight. The first is Cardinal John Foley, who I first got to know back in the early 90s when I was a cub reporter on the Vatican beat. By that stage, he was already ensconced in Rome as the head of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, but he always made the rounds of Catholic press events in the States. I remember the first time I met him was at some Catholic press event. I want to say this was like 94, 95, something like that, and I can't even remember where it was. But I introduced myself to him, and he said, "Okay, so you've just been hired by the National Catholic Reporter." And I said, "Yes." He said, "All right, well, let's sit down. I'd like to get to know you." So we sat down in the hotel bar wherever this conference was taking place. And one of the things I learned immediately about Archbishop Foley is that he had a remarkable, in some ways appalling and dreadful, but nevertheless remarkable sense of humor. So we're over a glass of beer, and he asked me some question about myself, and it was clear he wasn't buying the answer, okay? So he leaned in, okay, allowing his pectoral cross to dangle from his neck, right? He looked me in this eye with this, like, deep, sonorous baritone he had, and he said to me, "Are you jerking my chain?" It was clear to me from the get-go that this was not going to be your stereotypical stuffed shirt cleric. Now, of course, I got to know Archbishop and later Cardinal Foley much better when I moved to Rome, where he was a cherished, well, not only was he a terrific resource, but he was also a cherished friend of the press corps in Rome. Foley had a remarkably positive outlook on the media business. He was profoundly convinced that smart, intelligent, informed, and responsible journalism could change the world. He believed it, and he acted that way. And so he became not only somebody I would go to for information, but also a kind of, almost a kind of my pastor in Rome over those years. It was sometimes said of Archbishop Foley that he was too nice a guy for his own good in the world of the Vatican. And that is to say, he never played the kind of rough and tumble politics that the Vaticans can sometimes be distinguished for. And I think it's probably fair as an assessment. But I will tell you the flip side of that is no one enjoyed greater personal respect in that world than John Foley did. No one's absence when he left was felt more keenly by people at high positions and low than John Foley. And when he died in December 2011, I have never witnessed an outpouring of grief and affection as universal and as sincere, I think, as surrounded John Foley. Because the thing of it is, when people looked at John Foley, when they experienced John Foley, yes, they saw the Cardinal's red hat. Yes, they saw the insignia of the Archbishop's office. Yes, they saw a head of a powerful dicastery in the Roman Curia. But beneath all of that, and profoundly more importantly, what they saw and what they experienced was a good and holy priest and a profoundly decent man. I think that's the legacy that John Foley leaves behind, and I hope in some measure I'm equal to that legacy here tonight. But in any event, I feel like I have the opportunity tonight to pay off an old historical debt to a man who made a profound difference in my life, but more importantly, a profound difference in the way the Catholic Church is covered in the global media. Okay. Now, the second sort of missing partner in the conversation tonight would be your Archbishop, Archbishop Charles Chaput. Who is an old and dear friend. Archbishop Chaput is, of course, a Capuchin. I was educated by the Capuchins out in the high plains of western Kansas as a young buck. Grew up about 90 miles or so from where Archbishop Chaput did. He came of age in Concordia, Kansas. I grew up in Hayes. But we know most of the same people, have had most of the same friends over the years. In some ways, it feels to me like carrying coals to Newcastle to come to Philadelphia to give you lessons on effective church communications, because the truth of it is, you have got a living, breathing role model of effective church communications here in Philadelphia in the person of Archbishop Charles Chaput. He is utterly engaged with the culture. He is utterly uninhibited in being able to engage even the tough that the culture presents to us. Speaks the language of the street as opposed to a kind of abstract ecclesiastical argot. He is in so many ways, I think, a sort of graduate seminar waiting to be taught about how to communicate effectively on behalf of the church. But more than that, he has been enormously supportive of me over the years. I consider him a treasured friend. Now, before I poison the Archbishop's reputation, let me be clear, he has not always been uniformly supportive or of everything I have said and done over the years, but even when he has been critical, it has been the criticism of a friend rather than the criticism of an enemy. And it has been, that too has been precious to me over the years. So here tonight, I feel like I'm not only paying off a debt to Cardinal Foley, I also feel like I'm paying off a debt to Archbishop Chaput. All I can tell you, to those of you who live in this archdiocese, is that when you got Archbishop Chaput not so long ago, ladies and gentlemen, you won the lottery, and I hope you're grateful for it. Okay? All right. By the way, for those of you whose jobs compel you to do a lot of public speaking, I really recommend this to you as a rhetorical strategy. Always start by flattering your hosts. Okay? You know, if you do that, you can usually get away with murder. And let's test that theory, shall we, by diving into the heart of tonight's talk. I've been asked to speak to you on church and social communications. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, I am what the Italians call a Vaticanista, which means it is my full-time professional work to track the goings-on in that 108-acre island of ecclesiastical life in the heart of Rome we call the Vatican, to follow the Pope, and to use that as a springboard for doing the broader global Catholic story. So my reflections tonight are largely going to be on Pope Francis, because I think we have in front of us right now, I mean, if you have in Philadelphia locally a model of effective church communications, we have on the global stage an enormously powerful model of effective church communications. Let me put this to you in a different way. I am a journalist, and if you all in this room tonight have a right to expect nothing else from me, and you would be well advised not to expect much more than this, by the way, but if you have a right to expect nothing else, you have a right to expect that I get my facts right. So let us begin tonight with a fact, not a hunch, not a theory, not an anecdotal impression, but a hardcore, take it to the bank, 100% verifiable, empirical reality. And that hang your hat on it fact is that Pope Francis is an absolute communications sensation. He is by far the most popular religious and spiritual leader on the face of the planet, and one of the most popular public figures of any sort. Now, there are a variety of different ways I could document that for you. For instance, we could talk about his Twitter following. Are you all aware that Pope Francis just crossed the 19 million mark in terms of his following on Twitter? This makes him by far the most popular, most followed religious leader on Twitter, though not yet the most followed human being in absolute. Do y'all know who the most followed person on Twitter actually is? Shout it out if you think you know the answer. Cardinal. Good guess, but no. Bam! No. The correct answer, ladies and gentlemen, is Katy Perry. Rounding out the top 5 beyond U.S. President Barack Obama are, in order, Justin Bieber, okay, Lady Gaga, okay, and some other pop culture sensation I'm forgetting. Moral of the story is, yes, surely, ladies and gentlemen, the apocalypse cannot be far behind, okay, that this is the world we live in. You know, give the poor Pope a break. He's only been on Twitter 2 years, and 19 million isn't that bad. Or, you know, we could talk about his poll numbers. Again, it is a fact, not a hunch or a theory. It is a hardcore fact that in every corner of the world in which popular opinion can be scientifically measured, this Pope has approval ratings that politicians and celebrities would sacrifice their children to pagan gods to obtain. Okay? I mean, for example, last week, the Pew Forum, which is the most respected think tank on religion and public policy in the United States, came out with a new survey which found that Pope Francis's overall approval rating in the United States is almost 80%, and his approval rating among American Catholics is at 90%. Just so you don't miss the point, that's 90%. Okay. By the way, as a footnote to all of that, you really should drill down into the details of the Pew survey findings, because one of the most fascinating elements of their results, because the Pew people, in addition to asking respondents to identify themselves Catholic or non-Catholic, they also asked them to identify themselves as conservative or moderate to liberal. And the interesting thing is that Pope Francis's approval rating among self-identified conservative Catholics in the United States is actually higher than it is among self-identified moderate to liberals. He got a 94% approval rating from Catholic conservatives, self-identified, and an 87% approval rating from moderates to liberals, which I think says something about the good sense of the typical American Catholic, that they have been able to see beneath some of the hype and some of the mythology around this Pope and appreciate the truth, which is that he may be a reformer in multiple ways, but certainly not at the level of doctrine. At the level of doctrine, he is as robustly orthodox as John Paul II or Benedict XVI or any of the popes who preceded him. If I can give this to you in a soundbite, ladies and gentlemen, this is not Che Guevara in a cassock. Okay? That said, I think the overall number here of a 90% approval rating of American Catholics is remarkable. And what I'd ask you to do just for a moment is to sit with that number, 90%, and put it in the context of what I'm presuming all of us in this lecture hall here tonight know about how badly divided the Catholic Church in the United States is about most everything, right? I mean, the truth of it is, under ordinary circumstances, it would be tough to get 90% of the Catholics in this country to agree that today is Tuesday, okay? I mean, on the left, you would have somebody who would suspect this is a hierarchical plot to control our sense of time. And, you know, somewhere on the far right in the Traddy camp, you would have somebody who thinks we should still be using the Julian calendar. I mean, you know, right? So I would submit in that context, okay, this result is nothing short of flabbergasting. And frankly, if we ever get around to beatifying and canonizing Jorge Mario Bergoglio, I think this could count as his first miracle, right? By the way, if any of you canon law courses, yes, I do know that technically speaking, a miracle in a beatification process has to occur after death, but this was just for purposes of illustration, okay? But it's none of those statistical measures I want to offer you to illustrate this Pope's popular appeal. Instead, what I'd like to do is tell you a story. This story comes from the Holy Father's trip to Brazil in July 2013 for World Youth Day, his first overseas journey as Pope. Now, that trip culminated with two events on Rio de Janeiro's Copacabana Beach, right? The world's most famous stretch of sand and surf, okay? Two events on Copacabana Beach, the concluding vigil Saturday evening and the final Mass Sunday morning, in which Pope Francis drew crowds in excess of 3 million people to that spot, which shattered the previous attendance record at Copacabana, which was held by, wait for it, the Rolling Stones. Okay, I mean, this is how you know you've arrived, right? You know, as a pop culture phenomenon. Everywhere the Pope went, he was an absolute magnet for humanity. Now, however, the story I want to tell comes from Tuesday during World Youth Day week, because that's the day the Pope wanted to go from Rio de Janeiro to Aparecida, which is the location of the most famous Marian shrine in Brazil, one of the most popular Marian shrines in all of Latin America. This Pope, as the good Latin American pastor that he is, has an enormous kind of raging devotion to the Blessed Mother, and he wanted to be able to consecrate his entire papacy to her by visiting that shrine. So all the way, in Aparecida is about 70 kilometers or so outside of Rio, all the way along the highway, Brazilians were lined up 2, 3, 4, 5 deep. I mean, it was just phenomenal in terms of the turnout. And when we got to Aparecida, it was another oceanic crowd. There were maybe 200,000 people there. Now, I was in the press bus, right? So I was behind the Pope Mobile. When we actually pulled in behind the Basilica in Aparecida, this was supposed to be a secure zone, right? It was supposed to be cordoned off, so the crowds weren't supposed to be able to penetrate. Somehow, however, there was this gaggle of Latin American nuns that had worked their way into the... So when the door to the Pope Mobile opens and he pops out, they start shrieking like teenage girls at a Justin Bieber concert. Okay, they rush him. They're planting him with wet, sloppy kisses. Okay, he's standing there taking selfies with them. It's a total mob scene. Now, and there was this whole, and the Brazilians, by the way, had deployed like 20,000 troops and cops to prevent this kind of thing from happening, and there was a whole phalanx of them standing there in uniform doing absolutely nothing. So I pulled one of these guys aside and I said, hey, you know, why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you getting in the way? And he looks at me and he gives me a kind of oracular response. Okay, he says, look at me, man. I've got a combat helmet on my head. I've got ammo strapped across my chest. I am not going to be the guy caught on YouTube beating up a nun. Okay? Just is not going to happen. Right? Now, this young man, he couldn't have been any more than 21 or 22. I think inadvertently, he had sort of stumbled across the secret of this Pope's popular appeal, which is that this Pope generates such an electricity, that there is such a ferment around him, that any attempt to bottle it up or rein it in is destined to fail. And therefore, ordinarily, the better strategy is simply not to try. Okay? Now listen, I mean, you know, it's fun to catalog all the ways in which the Pope has become a rock star, and we could go on. I mean, we could talk about all the magazine covers he's been on, right? I mean, including improbably enough Rolling Stone. And I know I'm dating myself here, but yes, I did buy 5 copies for my mother. Okay, none of you get the Dr. Hook reference, fine. Anyway, but the real question, obviously, is what is underneath that, okay? I mean, beneath the celebrity appeal and beneath the kind of pop culture sizzle, what is it that people are responding to? Okay, and I want to suggest to you that there are 3 qualities that Pope Francis just palpably, at least 3, I'm not presenting this to you as an exhaustive list, but there are at least 3 qualities that Pope Francis just palpably exudes that make him such an effective communicator. Okay, in order, those qualities are candor, spontaneity, and compassion. Candor, spontaneity, and compassion. I think the wider world has recognized those 3 things in this figure and that they are responding to it. And to illustrate, and I think those 3 qualities need to be in the mix in any effective program of church communications. Let me just, in brief, tell you a quick story to illustrate each in what we've seen and heard from Pope Francis over the first 2 years of his papacy. And of course, let's remember, the 2-year anniversary will be this Friday. It will be 2 years exactly this Friday. from the night March 13th, 2013, when Pope Francis was elected. Let's begin with candor. I think this has got to be one of the defining characteristics of this Pope as a communicator, his capacity to simply blow past the normal sort of diplomatic cant in the kind of indirection that we have come to associate with most other global leaders, and simply get to the heart of the matter in a remarkably open and honest fashion. Now, we have seen that repeatedly. Let me tell you the first time this came home to me like a sledgehammer. This was on the Pope's return flight from Brazil to Rome at the end of his trip to World Youth Day. Now, it has become one of the characteristics of his papacy that on the return legs of all of his overseas journeys, he does these impromptu press conferences, right, on the plane, okay, with the press corps that is traveling with him. You know, I've been traveling with popes for a long time. I mean, it began in the John Paul II years. I did all of Benedict XVI's international trips, and I've done all of Francis's trips. So this first occasion, we had no idea what to expect, okay, at the end of this trip. We didn't know if the Pope was going to come back or not, and if he did, what the dynamic was going to be. And neither, by the way, did his Vatican handlers. I can tell you for sure. We were asking his paid communications retinue, you know, what the deal was going to be, and their answer, we have no idea, okay? So we get on the plane, we take off from Rio. After about 30 minutes, the word comes back, the Pope is coming, so get the cameras set up and all of that. 15 minutes later, the Pope comes back, he asks for a microphone, he looks at us, basically says in Italian, "What do you got?" Okay, and for the next hour and 20 minutes, you know, we were off the races with this absolutely no holds barred, no script, no filters, nothing off the table. You know, everything is fair game, sort of sessions with the Holy Father. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I told you I began covering the Vatican in the mid-90s. I have been doing this man and boy for 20 years. I will tell you, as a Vatican correspondent, sometimes in the dead of night, in those dark hours, you lay awake dreaming of a moment when you can ask the Pope absolutely anything you want to. You never actually think you're going to live to see them happen, but there it was in full living color. Okay, I mean, again, to put this to you in a soundbite, I have sometimes said of Alitalia Flight 4001 from Rio de Janeiro to Rome on the 28th of July, in many ways it was nothing to write home about. The seats were uncomfortable, the food was mediocre, but I will give it this, the in-flight entertainment was absolutely spectacular. Okay, and of course, that was the first opportunity in which we had this sort of unfiltered access to the Pope, and I will tell you, about the press corps. We had a full hour and 20 minutes, and it was really only about an hour into it that we realized he was actually serious. Okay, I mean, if you go back and you look at the transcript of that first exchange, you will find that the first hour was consumed almost entirely with softball questions. Okay, I mean, for example, it had been a big deal in the Brazilian media when Francis had landed in Rio de Janeiro and walked down the stairs on his own, carrying his own black bag. Okay? So somebody popped up to ask him, "Holy Father, can you tell us what was in that black bag?" Okay? And jokingly, he looked at us and smiled and said, "Don't worry, it was not the nuclear football." Okay? And then when, you know, I mean, so it was that kind of exchange for a long time. And it was only fairly late into the game that we realized, oh my God, he's actually willing to take any question we want to ask him. Now, what you have to know is that the big scandal that had been brewing in Rome immediately prior to the Pope's departure for World Youth Day was a situation involving the Pope's nominee as the prelate of the Vatican Bank, that is kind of his eyes and ears in the Vatican Bank, an Italian Monsignore by the name of Gian Battista Ricca. And there had been a kind of steamy expose in one of the big Italian news magazines, kind of their equivalent of Time or People or something like that. It's called L'Espresso. Alleging that when Ricca, years before, in the late 90s, when he had been a papal diplomat in Uruguay, he had been guilty of some fairly questionable conduct. Okay, now, nothing criminal and no accusations of sexual abuse, but there were suggestions of things like cruising gay bars and so on. Anyway, raising questions about his fitness for this particular role. So that was the 800-pound, you know, elephant or gorilla in the room with this exchange with the press. And it took us an hour before anyone finally worked up the courage to be able to ask the Pope this question. And none of us expected he would actually answer it directly. Okay, but he did. Okay, he kind of smiled, and it was I had the clear impression he wanted to say, "I have been waiting for you guys to get around to this." Okay, but he didn't quite do it. And he said, "Listen, we have launched an investigation. We have not found anything to confirm the charges that have been brought against Monsignor Rica. He has my trust as far as I'm concerned. He remains on the job," which was far more information than we thought we were going to get. And then he went on, ladies and gentlemen, to utterly change the world. Okay, or at least to change the narrative about the Pope and the Catholic Church, with 5 words that will echo in history, that I predict will be part of this Pope's obituary when the time comes, hopefully many years from now. And those 5 years, of course, those 5 words were, of course, "Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge?" We'll come back to that in a moment. But the point here is that this Pope has a unique willingness, a kind of unique interior freedom to engage questions head on and to answer them honestly and candidly and openly in a way that is sort of qualitatively new. Okay? First, I think, pillar of Francis's ability as a communicator, his candor. Okay? Secondly is spontaneity. Listen, this Pope's spontaneity has become the stuff of legend. Okay? If ever there was a kind of shoot from the hip, let it all hang out, uninhibited figure on the throne of Peter, it is Pope Francis. Now, you can document that in a variety of different ways, but you can also see it not only in the Pope's words, but in his deeds. And I'll tell you a quick story to make the point. This Pope has as the cornerstone of his own personal spirituality the traditional Christian virtue of mercy. Okay? Mercy is actually his motto. His motto as Pope is the same motto he had as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. It's a Latin phrase that comes from a homily of the Venerable Bede about the gospel scene of the call of Matthew, and the line is miserando atque elegendo. So it's a little hard to render into English, but basically what it means is choosing through the eyes of mercy. Okay, so mercy is one of the cornerstones of his vision. And one of the ways in which his commitment to mercy becomes manifest is his passion for the sacrament of faith. Okay, and here's the story to illustrate the point. Popes, as I presume most of us here tonight know, are also bishops of Rome, right? They are the leaders of the local diocese in Rome. And one of the things they try to do in order to execute that aspect of the job description is they try to make visits to as many Roman parishes as they possibly can. Okay? There are some 300 parishes in Rome. I think by last count, John Paul got to almost 200 of them. Francis so far has visited 12. His most recent was this past Sunday. His first parish visit was on the 21st of May, 2013, when he went out to the parish of Saints Elizabeth and Zechariah, which is out in the Porta Pia neighborhood of Rome. It's on the northern outskirts of the city, kind of a working class neighborhood. Now, here's what you need to know, okay? The pastor at that parish is a Romanian immigrant by the name of Father Baioni Ambris. Okay, everybody there calls him Father Ben. The Pope was supposed to show up that morning at 10:30. Okay, now I went out afterwards and interviewed Father Ben, so I got the complete story. Pope was supposed to show up at 10:30. Okay, around 9:30 in the morning, Father Ben starts picking up in his ear the thump, thump, thump of a helicopter, right? The rotor wash. And initially he thinks, well, this is just the Italian carabinieri, right? The Italian security services who are kind of doing a flyover to make sure everything's copacetic. But that thump, thump, thump becomes louder and louder and louder, and finally he realizes, oh my God, this is the papal chopper. Okay? So after somebody runs to get the defibrillator to restart his heart, okay, he jogs out to the parking lot in the parish where they have set up a makeshift helipad. Papal chopper lands a full 45 minutes early. Okay? Francis pops out. Father Ben is there, of course, to greet him, and the Holy Father says, well, look, sorry for the early start, but in addition to saying Mass and chatting with the folks, I would also like to hear some confessions. Okay? Now, bear in mind, this was not part of the program. Okay, so Father Ben went and grabbed 8 people basically at random, okay, and told them, "You're going to confession." Okay. And it's actually kind of cute. I asked him afterwards, well, how did they react? And he said, one of the guys said, "Well, Father, that's sweet, but I don't want to lose my spot in line to see the Pope." He said, "Oh, trust me, you're going to see the Pope," right? And he brought these people into the church, lined them up in front of the confessional, one by one. Francis sat there, heard their sins, and then administered God's forgiveness. Now, in part, this was just him being a good Bishop of Rome. In part, he wanted to make a point about how important the sacrament of confession is to him. But I think in part also, this was just what has become a defining aspect of his papacy, which is the capacity to cut past protocol, to blow past plans and systems, and to respond in the moment to the human reality he sees before him. And in that moment, making his first parish visit as the Bishop of Rome, I believe he got out of bed that morning thinking to himself, it is impossible that I should do this without hearing confessions, and was not intimidated by the fact that this has not been organized or planned, or that there wasn't a kind of advance team that had laid out the fine points of it. Simply trusting in Providence that things would sort themselves out, and of course they did. And that spontaneity has become, as I say, one of the things that I think people around the world associate with this Pope. And it coupled with spontaneity, I think, is sincerity, that when he does these kind of off-the-cuff, random moments and gestures, that what people see in it is not simply a kind of faux PR exercise. They don't think this is the product of some kind of communications war room, that this has all been focused grouped to death, and he's been advised to do this kind of thing because it's going to play well. Instead, I think they see the kind of pastoral instincts of the man bubbling to the surface, refusing to be suppressed, and that's what they're responding to. Okay. Finally, compassion as a defining virtue of this Pope. Of course, the soundbite for this Pope's compassion, as we said a moment ago, is that immortal line that he uttered on the papal plane, "Who am I to judge?" Now, let's be clear. A bit like the face of Helen of Troy launched 1,000 ships, ladies and gentlemen, that soundbite has launched 1,000 acts of spin and disingenuity. Okay, I mean, it has been used and abused, sliced and diced all around the world in the most wildly disparate and often misleading ways. Let me give you one story that illustrates the point. I was in South Korea with Pope Francis in August. Okay? Now, I have long been a smoker, and one of the discoveries for me about South Korea, because stereotypically I think about Asia as a place that is fairly relaxed about smoking, but it turns out this is not the case in South Korea. They are kind of fanatically hostile to smoking. So not only could I not smoke in my hotel, I couldn't smoke in front of my hotel. I had to go down the street and around the corner, okay, to be able to do it. So during the nights of the papal visit, repeatedly, come an evening, I would find myself planted in that space where the hotel was still visible, but it was walking distance away, trying to enjoy a brief calm in the middle of the media storm that Pope Francis always is when he travels. And the first night I was out there doing that, there was a guy who came up to me, Korean guy, short little guy, wearing a baseball hat and a jacket, who asked me what I was doing in town. And I said, well, you know, I'm a journalist. I'm here covering some news, so forth and so on. And eventually he got around to the question he really wanted to pop, which is, would you be interested in any companionship? Okay, would you be interested in meeting a nice Korean lady? To which I said, no, thank you, you know, really not interested, and kind of blew him off. Okay, that was night one. Night two, he comes up and makes the same approach, and I said to him, look, man, I appreciate the work ethic, but, you know, I'm married and I actually try to take that seriously, so maybe you could find somebody else, all right? Third night, he comes up and makes the approach again. Okay, I said, look, okay, aside from the fact that I'm married, I want you to know, I am here covering the Pope, and the entire papal party is staying in this hotel. This may not be your best client pool this week, okay? The Korean pimp, okay, looks at me, and he says, oh, you're with the Pope? I said, yes, I flew in with the Pope. And he says, oh, I really like this Pope. He doesn't judge. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is someone who didn't quite get, the point that Pope Francis was trying to make. However, despite all of the ways in which that signature soundbite has kind of been spun and misapplied and so on, I think at the core of it, what people recognize about it is that this is a pope who was trying to project deep compassion, even for people whose lifestyle choices in a particular moment may not fully comport with the Christian ideal. And I think that has come through over and over and over again. And I think it is not a communication strategy in the explicit sense of being reflective or thought out. I think it's instinctive. It's who the man is. But it is a marvelous communication strategy that has the capacity to disarm people sometimes, even when they come into situations potentially with a kind of critical filter about what the church stands for or what the Pope stands for. Another story out of Korea to make that point. One of the key items Pope's itinerary when he was in South Korea is he went to a center for severely disabled, ailing children, which is about 30 kilometers or so outside of Seoul. Now, you have to know that that center in Korean circles is actually quite controversial. It was founded by a very charismatic Korean priest in the 70s. And for his fans and his admirers, he is a hero of the gospel, but for his critics, he is basically a con man. That is, what his critics would say is that he is much more interested in raising money than he is serving the sick and the disabled. Their argument is that this facility he runs is institutional and cold and antiseptic and not up to speed and not particularly caring. And he's a very controversial figure in Korean circles. And if there was going to be a tipping point in the Pope's itinerary where the kind of love affair of the media turned into criticism, that might well have been it, because there were a lot of people in Korean Catholic circles who were raising objections to Holy Father kind of legitimizing, in a sense, this operation by his presence. Now, when the Holy Father got there, he walked into this hall which was full of these severely disabled young people, many of them in wheelchairs, some of them even on gurneys. And you could hear the groans, because many of them were not simply disabled, but they were in physical agony, and so those groans kind of reverberated in the room. And the place was obviously also full of their caretakers. Pope had a prepared speech. He simply set it aside, recognizing what was in front of him in that moment. He delivered this very brief 10 minutes in Spanish, off-the-cuff, impromptu reflection about the meaning of suffering in the Christian tradition and the dignity of suffering, the redemptive value, not using this language because it wouldn't have been understood, but that was the point, the redemptive value of suffering. But then what he spent most of the rest of his time doing was moving through the room, being present to all of those people, one by one, caressing them, consoling them. If they were in a position where they could communicate, asking for their stories and sharing a bit of his own. It went on for more than an hour and a half. He was supposed to be out of there in 30 minutes. He was there for an hour and 45. And when he left that room, the place was absolutely electric. The people were erupting in applause and cheers. They were weeping. And the Holy Father was doing high fives and slapping hands on the way out. And so, point is, there was a media environment prior to that moment where people were loaded for bear, ready to go after what they perceived to be an example of the institutional hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. And rather than engaging that storyline in any kind of negative or defensive way, the Holy Father simply changed the storyline. He provided us with a completely different story to do, which was the story of his amazing capacity to be pastorally present to the most broken and vulnerable and the most forgotten and the most isolated people on the planet. It was an astonishing moment that you almost had to be there to fully perceive. But my point is, his compassion, because it comes off not just as artifice, but as sincere, a genuine reflection of what's in the heart and the mind of this man, it has the capacity to disarm criticism of all sorts and utterly redirect conversations about Catholicism. And we saw that on display during that moment in South Korea. All right, so candor, spontaneity, compassion, okay, defining qualities of effective church communications. Now, if we are going to operate in the spirit of candor, I think probably a couple of footnotes here are in order, because I don't think there is any serious doubt that exuding these qualities of candor and spontaneity and compassion at times comes with a risk. And I think we have seen Pope Francis at times pay the price for his commitment to those three qualities. And I want to flag two risks for you in particular. One is confusion. That is a certain lack of clarity, okay, about what the church stands for in key issues or where the church may be going. I mean, you know, you may remember back shortly after his election in October of 2013, the Pope chose to give an interview to a left-wing, non-believing Italian journalist by the name of Eugenio Scalfari, the headline of which is, "God is not a Catholic." Now, you could almost hear the blood pressure of theology departments all around the world going up as they posed the question, what the hell does that mean, right? Even who am I to judge? As I say, I mean, the Holy Father is well aware that has been subject to 1,001 competing interpretations, and not all of them reliable. So believe me, he is well aware, okay, of the risk of a certain lack of clarity in some of the things he says and does. If you want an insight into his style, the way he addresses that lack of clarity is that he does not repeal what he had said or done before, but he finds occasions to make sure that he sets whatever the original message was in the proper context. So, for example, in that interview with Scalfari and in other interviews, Pope Francis at the beginning of his papacy had said something like, "I don't think I need to talk much about abortion and gay marriage and contraception because the positions of the church are already well known." And there was some concern in some quarters that meant he was retreating from a robust defense of the gospel of life, or kind of throwing in the towel in defense of the sacredness of all human life. He has found multiple occasions since then to make abundantly clear that's not the case, including once again when he was in South Korea, where the only addition he made to his itinerary was a visit to a symbolic cemetery for the victims of abortion, an evocative green hilltop outside Seoul, dotted with white crosses to represent the victims of abortion. Even though abortion is illegal in South Korea, it has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. The Pope heard about it and made a point of wanting to go there, and of course invited the cameras, the TV cameras, and the photographers with him. That image would make the rounds of the world, and it would make a point about his commitment to the pro-life cause. Okay, so that's how the Pope, to use the American argument, that's how he revises and extends the record. Okay, and you see him repeatedly doing that. So certain confusion is one risk of this communication style. A second risk is quite clearly exacerbating division in the church. And I think we have seen some evidence of it as well, certainly around the Synod of Bishops on the Family last October in Rome. I suspect we will see it again this October when the Pope holds a second Synod on the Family. The hot-button issues at that Synod, as I presume all of you know, were whether or not Catholics who divorce and remarry outside the church ought to be welcomed back into communion, how welcoming the church ought to be to people in irregular relationships, in particular same-sex unions, and third, how positive our moral evaluation can be of those irregular relationships. That is, when we see a couple living together outside of marriage, is it possible to say that even though that falls short of the Christian ideal, nevertheless there may be real virtues and real moral quality in terms of the quality of love, the quality of mutual support, and so forth inside that relationship that we can affirm? There was lively debate on each of those 3 points at the last Synod. I am 100% convinced there will be equally lively debate on those points at the Synod this October. And in part, the debate is so lively and so animated because Pope Francis himself has sort of set a tone calling for what he has described as bold speech and humble listening. bold speech and humble listening. That is, he's kind of ripped the lid off the debate in some ways. By the way, having covered that first synod, I can report to you for sure that the bishops got the bold speech part right. I'm not sure they're yet up to speed at the humble listening. Perhaps that's what we'll get round two, this October. But in any event, I think to some extent that robust and animated, and in some quarters, on both sides of all of these arguments, alarming sort of sense about where things might be going, created a climate in which some of the pre-existing divisions in the church, I think, were exacerbated. Once again, I think Pope Francis is profoundly aware of that. He watched that synod play out, and he gave a speech at the end, which was his attempt to sort of bring the house back into rough unity, in which he said, we need to avoid two extremes in this conversation. We need to avoid what he called a hostile rigidity, but at the same time, we need to avoid what he called a false mercy. Okay? And he's trying to steer a middle course between those two extremes. Look, my message to you is this. I think Francis knows that some aspects of the way he comports himself in public, both his words and his deeds, occasionally open themselves to confusion, and occasionally they exacerbate division. He's aware of that and trying to do what he can to respond to it. I also want to tell you, however, that I see no evidence that he's going to allow himself to be reined in by any of those concerns. Because the thing you need to know about Pope Francis is this. Okay? He regards his election to the papacy. Well, of course, all popes regard their election to the papacy in some sense as an act of divine providence. But he believes there is almost literally a miracle at the core of the kind of pope he has become. Because here's the thing you have to account for with Pope Francis that takes us beyond the realm of human logic, folks. If you don't know this, there is a sharp contrast between the man Jorge Mario Bergoglio was in Argentina and the Pope that Francis has become. Now, some things are the same. His commitment to the poor, his capacity to be a good manager, his personal humility and simplicity. They were all there in Buenos Aires, and they're still there in Rome. But the difference is this. In Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was nobody's idea of a pop culture sensation. Okay? Do you know how many interviews he gave during the 15 years he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires? He gave 5 during those 15 years. He's given 3 times the number since he's become Pope in the 2 years that he's become Pope. When he hated appearing in public, avoided it like the plague, and on those rare occasions when he had to, okay, his friends would say he came off as shy. His critics would say he came off as dull and boring. But in any event, nobody came away saying that he had turned the world on with his smile. Okay. In fact, just as an exercise some night, you should go back to your computers, get on Google, go on Google Image, and do a search. Jorge Mario Bergoglio and not Pope Francis. Okay, find pictures of him from the Buenos Aires years. You will almost never find a picture of him smiling. It just was not part of his public image. I mean, to capsulize all this for you, after Francis was elected and he erupted onto the global stage, I went down to Buenos Aires and I interviewed his sister, Maria Elena, who was his only surviving sibling. And I asked her, so what do you make of the contrast between, your brother here and your brother in Rome? And her answer, I don't recognize this guy. Where is my brother and what have you done with him? Because that's how sharp the contrast actually is. And obviously, this has not been lost on people who have known the Holy Father for a long time. And in my new book, The Francis Miracle, and this is actually the point of the word miracle in the title, I tell this story. A Latin American cardinal who is an old-time friend of Bergoglio, known him for 30 years, went in to see him for an hour of private time, just the two of them, last Christmas time. So not this most recent Christmas, but the one before it. And the cardinal afterwards told me the story. He said he wagged his finger at the Pope and said, you are not the same guy I knew in Buenos Aires. What's happened to you? Okay? And the Pope's answer was, the night of my election, I had an experience of the closeness of God. I had a mystical experience in the Pauline Chapel where I had paused for prayer. I had an experience of God's closeness and God's presence. It's left me with a sense of interior peace and interior freedom that has never left me. Never left me. In other words, folks, this kind of spontaneous, freewheeling, shoot from the hip, let it all hang out style, as Pope Francis understands it, okay, this is not the product of some kind of public relations calculation about what is going to work best. No. He believes this is the kind of pope that God has called him to become. Okay? And therefore, I would suggest that despite the risks, and they are real, and the pope, good Jesuit politician that he is utterly cognizant of them, but I don't see any particular evidence that he's going to allow himself to be obstructed in terms of being able to continue to exude these qualities, because he is, in a very literal sense of the word, a man on a mission. Okay? All right, final thought. It occurs to me now as we reach the end that I may have left one item off the list in terms of the hallmarks of effective communications of any sort, and including, therefore, effective church communications. And it is really a quality we dare not forget about, and that is a lively sense of humor. Okay? Because the truth of it is that if we don't have the capacity to laugh at ourselves and our circumstances once in a while, we are going to spend all of our time trying to fight down heartburn. Okay? Now, Pope Francis, of course, exudes a terrific sense of humor. But if you'll forgive me, I would like to, in this case, tell a story to illustrate the point that comes not from Pope Francis, but from his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI. Who is, of course, a great friend and resource for the current Pope. Pope Francis has described having Benedict around as being like having your grandfather living at home, which is kind of odd if you think about the fact that Benedict is only 10 years older than Francis, but, I mean, you get the point. It's affectionate, right? And frankly, I am constantly trying to make the argument with my colleagues in the media that the story of what Benedict and Francis have in common is far more profound and important than the story of anything that might separate them. So I think a Benedict story to wrap things up here tonight is in order. Huh? This story comes from April 2005. You may remember that was kind of a busy time on the Vatican news beat. Okay, we had the twilight days and the eventual death of Pope John Paul II. We had that massive, astronomic, oceanic turnout in Rome to mark his passing. I mean, the city of Rome, the Comune di Roma, which is the civil government there, estimates that in addition to 5 million Romans who showed up to mourn the Pope's passing, somewhere between 5 and 10 million extra people came into and out of town in those days between the 2nd of April, when the Holy Father died, and the 19th, when his funeral mass was celebrated. From a broadcast point of view, the funeral mass of John Paul II is believed to have been the most watched event in human history, full stop. Watched by more people around the world than any other event in the history of television. The estimated global audience is around 2 billion. Bear in mind, the estimated global population today is about 6.5 billion. Okay, so not too bad. Okay. And then you had the drama of the conclave and the election of the new Holy Father, Benedict XVI, and all of that. Now, as the media-savvy Americans, all of you are, okay, you know that whenever there is a major global news event, one thing in this culture will follow it as surely as night follows day, and that is there will be a cottage industry of Instabooks looking to cash in on all that interest, right? And the way I know this, ladies and gentlemen, is that I participated in that cottage industry. Okay, I brought out my own Instabook titled The Rise of Benedict XVI. Now, there's a tradition in the Vatican Press Corps that when one of us writes a book about the Holy Father, we typically inscribe a copy to him, and then we present it either to his priest secretary or to his spokesperson or to somebody in his inner circle. Okay? To be honest with you, it had never entered my thoughts for a moment that the Pope actually reads these books. I mean, I had kind of envisioned a box in the basement of the Apostolic Palace, where they all kind of gather dust, right? So the Holy Father is elected in April. I write my book in May. It comes out June 1st. I dutifully inscribe a copy to Pope Benedict, who, of course, I'd known for 20 years by that stage. And then I gave it to Joaquin Navarro Valls, who at the time was the Spanish layman who was still the Pope's spokesperson, and then totally forgot about it, right? Now, flash forward to August of that year, August 2005. My wife and I are back in the United States on summer vacation. We're out in rural western Kansas, which is where I grew up, visiting my grandma. By that stage, we had lost my mom and my grandpa, but my grandma was still going strong. My grandma, by the way, lived in a small western Kansas hamlet called Hill City, which I believe is the worst place name in America, because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? Anyway, there we are. I mean, just to give you a sense of the cultural milieu I'm talking about, the only time anybody ever goes to this place is during the fall, because that's pheasant hunting season. You know what a pheasant is? It's a little game bird, kind of like a turkey. And hunting these birds is really popular out in the wilds of western Kansas. I mean, it's the only, listen, I visited, 67 countries with John Paul II. I made all of Benedict's trips. I made all of Francis's trips. I have traveled the highways and byways of the world. I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings. But the one hotel in Hill City, America, called the 11 rooms, called the Western Hills Motel, is the only place I've ever stayed. It has a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." Okay? When I first took my wife there, she thought it was some kind of weird sexual double entendre. I had to explain, no, this is face value stuff, all right? So anyway, this is where we were, okay, just to give you a sense of the setting, all right? And one morning, of course it would have been afternoon in Rome, the Holy Father at this stage, Pope Benedict, was up in the north of Italy on vacation. And I think he was coming down for tea or something. I don't know what was going on. But anyway, it was breakfast hour time. And my cell phone goes off, right? And you know how you can tell who's calling because, like, the name pops up on the screen. So, I mean, I knew it was Joaquin Navarro-Valls. And by the way, I cannot prove this to you empirically, but I am morally certain this was the first time a phone call was ever made from the papal household to Graham County, Kansas, because I can envision no other circumstances in which such a thing might have happened. But anyway, so, you know, I answer the call, and Joaquin says, well, listen, John, I wanted you to know the Holy Father came down this afternoon with your book in his hands. He asked me to deliver a message to you. I don't know about you, okay, but if you have just been told that the Pope has a personal reaction to something you have written about him, I would want to make sure that your tray table is in a full upright and locked position, you know, because the sky might get a little bumpy. But I said, well, Joaquin, that's, of course, you know, what's the message? Now, to get this, you have to understand that my book was divided into thirds, okay? The first third were the last days of John Paul II. The middle third was the inside story of how Cardinal Ratzinger had been elected as Pope Benedict, okay? And the last third were sort of my projections as to where his papacy was going to go, okay? So Joaquin says, well, the Holy Father's message is the following. He said, please thank Herr Dr. Allen for having written this book, particularly the last part about the future of my papacy, because it has saved me the trouble of thinking about it for myself. Obviously, he was kidding. Okay. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I think therein lies the secret. When we are, and all of us, in some way, shape, or form, at some point in our lives, all of us are going to be called upon to communicate on behalf of the church, whether it's, you know, in your parish, among your friends, in your workplace, or whether it's on television or it's on a blog, wherever it happens, whoever your market is, whoever your audience is, all of us at different times are communicators on behalf of the church. I would submit to you that if, in carrying forward that project of communications, we can exude those qualities, if we can exude candor, that is, rigorous honesty, if we can exude spontaneity, that is, that we're not delivering some kind of prefabricated boilerplate piece of rhetoric, but we're engaging the people who are in front of us and responding heart to heart with the questions that they have put to us. If we can exude compassion, and if we can do all of that with a lively sense of humor, that is, with a twinkle in our eye rather than bile in our spleens, that, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, is a winning strategy for church communications every day of the week, and to use the Western Kansas argot, twice on Sunday. Okay? Thank you. God bless you. God bless Saint Charles Borromeo. God bless Cardinal John Foley. God bless Archbishop Charles Borromeo. And ladies and gentlemen, viva il Papa!
Bravo. Take a few questions. John has graciously agreed to answer a few questions and enter into dialogue with you if you'd like to pose a few. If you can use the microphone that Casey is about to hand you, if you're interested in a question, that will help the sound, guys.
And hold on one second. Hello? Sorry, I promise you we're going to come to your question. Hang on one sec. Am I good? Okay. We're coming to you, sir, in just a moment. But first, just by way of priming the pump, let me give you both an invitation and a warning. The invitation is that you are welcome to anything about the presentation you just heard, but don't feel limited to that. If there's some other burning curiosity you have on your minds, or you see an 800-pound gorilla in the room, we're not talking about it. Whatever it is. I may not know the answer to your question, but ladies and gentlemen, I have spent the better part of 20 years working in American TV, where absolute ignorance is never a bar to talking about anything. And I see why I should get on our way here tonight. Now, the warning is that the good people at Saint Charles Borromeo are paying me to stand here for the next few minutes, whether you have questions or not. So if you don't come up with questions, I am simply going to subject you to more Pope jokes. And I warn you, this is not a consummation devoutly to be wished. You don't believe me? All right, here's a sample. Pope Francis walks into a bar with a frog on his shoulder. Bartender looks up and says, "Hey, that's kind of cool. Where'd you get it?" Frog says, "Buenos Aires." Let's not go down that road, okay? Yes, sir.
I thoroughly enjoyed this lecture, and I'm thinking that there's a lot of people that I know who would also enjoy it. Is there any way they can get the audio of this?
Somebody should be able to answer that question. This is being videoed, right? Yeah. And where? Tell the good people.
We'll make that available through the seminary's website.
All right, so check the seminary website. Yes. You with the eagle shirt.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mr. Allen. My question's on Pope Francis' popularity. And we were talking about the pupil, the extraordinary popularity the Pope is enjoying, second only to St. John Paul II, who I believe in the pupil was 93%.
Right.
But my question is Pope Francis' extraordinarily high popularity translating into what's been dubbed a Francis effect, defined by higher church attendance rates, more people going to confession,
Right.
more Catholics coming back to the church, all of that. And if it's not, what is his popularity achieving for the church, and is it reducing the hostility towards the Catholic Church and towards Christianity in general? Because it seems as if, empirically, that hostility towards the church has not gone away, it's only gotten worse. Looking around the world, persecution of Christians at an all-time high. The Catholic Church in America is defending its religious liberty against the federal government. So what is Pope Francis' popularity achieving for the church in concrete ways? Thank you.
That is a terrific question. And based on the intelligence of the question, I'm going to suggest that Chip Kelly ought to be calling you to get some advice on the offensive playbook. Look, first of all, to answer your question about what do we know statistically, okay, the truth is the jury is out in terms of whether there is any empirically quantifiable Francis effect. Pew, which did this survey just last week, a year ago, did a study in which they tried to ascertain if there was any bump either in weekly Mass attendance or in self-identification as Catholic pre-Francis versus post-Francis, and they could not find one. Okay. Now, on the other hand, Massimo Introvigne, who is probably the leading sociologist of religion in Italy, did a study at the same time in which he found that half the half the pastors in Italy reported increases in attendance at Mass and increases in demand for the sacrament of confession, which they did attribute to Pope Francis. So I think it's going to take the time for the dust to settle in terms of whether there's anything we can get our hands around. And bear in mind, as charismatic and electric a figure as Francis is, no one figure up to and including a pope can necessarily hold the tides of history at bay. I mean, you know, in the developed West, that is in Europe, in North America, you know, Australia and New Zealand and so on, we're simply living in a profoundly secular age in which the notion that anybody is going to be able to wind the clock back and bring us back to sort of the 1950s era, you know, measures of what counted as a thriving Catholic Church may be anachronistic. I mean, you know, John Paul gave it his best shot for almost 27 years. You know, and so in that sense, I think 2 years into the Francis experiment, it may be sure, you know, to be declaring it a failure because we haven't seen upticks in mass attendance in certain parts of the world. But I mean, listen, folks. I mean, you know, I know that that it's tempting for us as Americans or as Westerners to believe that we live in a time of Catholic decline because that's often what we see, right? I mean, you know, we see difficulties of generating vocations. We struggle to hand the faith on to the next generation. We have a hard time keeping our schools and our parishes afloat. And I know you just went through a very painful period of having to deal with all that, you know, here in Philadelphia. And those are our realities for sure, but they are not the global realities. I mean, you know, let's be 100% crystal clear that in our lifetimes, we are living through the greatest period of missionary expansion in the history of Roman Catholicism. Okay? The global Catholic story of our time is not contraction and it's not decline, it is astronomic growth. Do you know what the Catholic population of sub-Saharan Africa was in the year 1900? It was 1.9 million. Do you know what it was in the year 2000? It was 139 million. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a growth rate of 6,708%. I don't care what line of work you're in. If you have almost a 7,000% growth rate, that ain't too bad, okay? And so I don't want to succumb to this misleading narrative of decline because that really is not our story. But that said, I take your point. It would be great to see the charisma and the popularity of Pope Francis translating into something we can touch, you know, in terms of boosting the Church's functions. All I can tell you is anecdotal, okay? I spend a great deal of my life on the Catholic lecture circuit, not just in the States, but in different parts of the world. I move in and out of different Catholic venues all the time. Of course, I cover the Pope when he travels and all that. All I can tell you is that over the last 2 years, my gut tells me that something dramatic is going on. That is to say, every venue I step into, when I talk to ordinary rank-and-file Catholics, they will tell me that 2 years ago, that is, as of March 12th, 2013, they weren't really sure, you know, if they had a fighting chance, you know, to sort of make the gospel attractive and relevant to the people in their neighborhoods, and that somehow post-Pope Francis, he has created a moment of opportunity, you know, in which people are willing to at least take, and you use the word critical, and I like that, to at least take a look at what the Church is all about that isn't in the first instance suspicious or hostile or critical, okay, but is at least curious, and in some cases, because of Pope Francis, sympathetically curious. Okay? Now, however, one final point, question. What evangelical advantage do we take of the moment that Francis created? Look, let's face facts, okay? The facts are, the eyes of the world are on this Pope, and therefore the eyes of the world are upon us, right? And the question, and in some cases for the first time in a very long time, okay, and therefore the question is, what are they going to see? Okay, see, okay? And I can think of several plausible options in terms of what the answer to that question is. Okay, I mean, you know, one option is they could see basically a debating society in which people are ripping one another's throats apart, arguing over the precise theological significance of every last participle that flows from the Pope's mouth. I'm not sure that's a terrifically attractive missionary calling card. Okay, you know, another option is that they could look at a community that, despite its internal differences, is genuinely striving to come together to try to realize the iconic vision that this Pope has provided, a kind of job description of the Church in our time as the field hospital of humanity, right? The emergency room in which a broken and hurt and losing world goes to cure its wounds, okay? If that's what they see, I think that's a much greater inducement. Now, my point is that the answer to what people are going to see, and therefore down the line, whether there is a Francis effect or not, I don't believe that depends primarily on Francis. I think it also depends upon us. What kind of outreach do we provide? What kind of tone do we strike? What kind of face and voice of the church do we lift up? In other words, I would suggest if you're concerned about taking maximum evangelical advantage of the Francis moment, then it is a mistake to sit around waiting for him to ride in a white horse and fix all our problems for us. I think most of the heavy lifting has to be done by us. Hey, Matt.
How are you? John, can you talk a little bit about the business end of this? Evangelization is content, but it's also means. Can you tell me why the secular media company, Boston Globe, decided to make a vertical for the Catholic religion? What was their business thinking, and how long of a lifespan does it have?
If you want to ask me what the business plan behind this thing is, I have to tell you, I don't have the first earthly idea. This was not pitched to me in the first instance as a business enterprise, although obviously eventually we have to figure out how to make money off of it or the thing isn't sustainable. But in the first instance, this was the Boston Globe coming under new ownership. It had previously, I'm sure you know, been owned by the New York Times syndicate, and there was even talk at that stage about closing the thing down, that that maybe it didn't have a future. They then found a buyer in the person of John Henry, who rose to fame in Boston as the owner of the Boston Red Sox, the guy who broke the Babe's curse, right, and delivered 2 World Series championships. And by the way, a funny footnote to this, the first time I was brought in for a meeting with John Henry, the owner of the Globe, to discuss his vision for this specialized Catholic thing, he had volunteered to fly out to meet me someplace on his private jet because, of course, he's also a plutocrat. Ordinary people don't end up owning newspapers, as you know. So he had volunteered to fly someplace, and I said, well, it's really not necessary because I'm coming to Boston to give a lecture at Boston College in the fall, so why don't we just meet then? Turned out this was the night of Game 6 of the World Series, okay, the most recent series that the Sox clinched, okay? So I called his helper person the next morning saying, listen, I'm assuming that we're going to have to postpone this. And her answer, oh, no. Mr. Henry said this is very, very important, so we're still sending the car for you. So they send a car and drive me downtown because I'm supposed to be meeting him at Fenway, right? Now, of course, there is this gaggle of still drunk and ebullient Red Sox fans out front the stadium. So security has to clear a path so our car can get in, right? I go up, and I'm ushered into Henry's office, where he is still wearing the same soaked clothes he had on the night before. Somewhat disjointed conversation, but anyway, at the end of it, he says, okay, now it's time to go to lunch. We're going to meet, the publisher and the editor and whatever. He says, I'm going to drive. I said, okay, great. Down to the first base side, inside Fenway, where the hot dog stands are, which of course is where he's parked his Porsche, right? So we pop into his Porsche, and now the security guys are clearing a path to get out. And Henry is a little bit of a recluse. But in Boston, he's a kind of celebrity because of the success of the Sox, right? So when his Porsche pulls out in front of Fenway, the fans just go nuts. They're like, oh, John, thank you, this is great. So, we're rolling down the windows, and we're high-fiving, all of these Red Sox fans on the way out. And 30 seconds later, somebody sent me a link from one of the Boston area websites with a picture that said, John Henry, an unidentified Red Sox executive, exit Fenway Park after World Series triumph. It's fantastic. Anyway, Henry, basically his ambition now, to tell you the truth, his ambition now is to do for American journalism what he did for the Red Sox. That is to kind of pull them back from the brink and give them a new lease on life. And he wants to reinvent the American daily newspaper. And the way he has in mind to do that is to make the daily newspaper a constellation of special interests. So you carve out one project for Catholics. You carve out another project for stock car racing fans. You carve out another project for high tech. You carve out another project for the medical industry. And if you can bring on board audiences that we can measure in the 6 figures for each of those projects, you add them all up, pretty soon you were talking about a fairly compelling audience. Now, whether it'll work or not, I don't know, but that's his vision. And he began with the Catholic project, I think largely because Well, I think a variety of factors. One, because the Boston Globe had won a Pulitzer in 2002 for its coverage of the child sexual abuse scandals. Another, because Boston is overwhelmingly Catholic. Third, because it has a huge Catholic infrastructure, in terms of universities and associations and all of that. Fourth, because he wants to make the Globe not just a regional newspaper, but a national and international brand. And obviously, there is a national and international audience for Catholic coverage, right? So that's where he began. And then after that, after he made the initial approach and pitch, and after I agreed to do this, then he has stepped back, and it's become the editorial leaders of the Globe. What we have gotten is 100% affirmation from up top, from the brass, that this is something, this is an endeavor that he believes in and wants to support. And not, by the way, because John Henry is some kind of pietistic Catholic. I mean, I think he may be the least religious guy I've ever met in my life. Not hostile, but he just doesn't have the religion gene. For him, this is a business move. About trying to identify an untapped market that American journalism could serve and trying to serve it. You asked the question, how long is this going to go on? Listen, I think we've got about, I would give it 3 years, to make the point that this is not simply journalistically valuable, but that there is a market for it and that you can identify revenue streams behind it. I think after that stage, even being the beloved elder child of the owner probably in itself is not going to be enough. Yes?
I have a question about the Vatican. Did you see the Frontline documentary on the Vatican?
You mean the one about money? Because Frontline has actually done several documentaries on the Vatican. So which one are you?
It was about money, and it was about sexual.
Yeah. Saw it.
Is there truth to that documentary? And if so, is the Pope doing anything about it?
Well, look, I mean, if you don't know what he's talking about, Frontline, this was not a Frontline documentary. It was a documentary made by an Italian production company that they sold to Frontline. And it was a it was a documentary that exposed some of the more glaring financial scandals in and around the Vatican. Also talked about the child sexual abuse scandals and so on. Look, my reaction to it is, like so much coverage of the Vatican, my problem is not with the text, my problem is with the context. That is, individually, the facts were largely right, okay? So when they talked about Monsignor 500 euro, do you all know this story? This is a Vatican accountant for 20 years, a guy who worked in APSA, which is the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, which handles the Vatican's real estate and investment portfolio, or at least it did until recently. As I say, he had worked there for 20 years. He was allegedly getting by on a salary of 30,000 euros, so like 35 grand, in American dollars a year. But he owned an extensive network of multi-million-dollar real estate in southern Italy, and he had a private art collection that had originals by Gogh and Chagall. About that, and it's true. I mean, he was arrested by Italian magistrates. He was charged initially in a cash smuggling scheme that is worthy of like a Tom Clancy novel. I mean, he had a friend who was a former agent for the Italian equivalent of the CIA, and together they were trying to smuggle cash from Switzerland into Italy on behalf of a family, basically of arms merchants in Italy. I mean, it's true. He's been and later he was charged with a check kiting scheme. I mean, that's all true. The stories they told about the Vatican bank mess in the 70s and 80s, all true. Okay. However, the problem is, in my view, they had a great deal of coverage of what has gone wrong and relatively little corresponding coverage of what has gone right. Because the real story to tell about Vatican finances, in my view, would be the aggressive cleanup operation that began under Pope Benedict XVI. And by the way, never ever let people get off the hook with telling you that Francis is some kind of repudiation of Pope Benedict. Nothing is further from the truth. I mean, not only is there a close, affectionate relationship between the two men at an emotional level, but on a policy level, a lot of the stuff for which Francis gets applause actually began under Benedict. Okay, the whole simplification of the papacy, for instance. Yeah, okay, Francis, the day after his election, goes back to his hotel to pack his own bag and pay in his own bill. Do you know what Ratzinger did the day after his election? he went back to his apartment in the Piazza Leonina, where he had lived at in Rome, to pack his own bag and carry it back himself to the papal apartment. Before he left, he went around to knock on the 4 other doors in that building to say goodbye, not to the cardinals who lived there, because he knew he'd be seeing them again, but to the nuns who did the cooking and the cleaning, to thank them for being such good neighbors, and because he knew them personally, knew their names and knew their life stories and wanted to have the chance to say goodbye to them. So that is continuity, not repudiation. But even at a policy level, the financial cleanup, a lot of people are applauding Francis's financial reform, and rightly so. But it began life under Benedict. He was the first pope to open the Vatican to outside secular inspection in the form of Europe's anti-money laundering process called Moneyval. And there was ferocious internal resistance when he did it. A lot of people in the Holy See, senior guys who had been around a long time, were saying this is a travesty because, previous popes have paid in blood to prevent this kind of intrusion on the autonomy and sovereignty of the Holy See, that this is a betrayal of those sacrifices. But Benedict stared down that opposition and went ahead and did it. And similarly with the sex abuse stuff. So, all that by way of saying that if you look at Francis's record, he came into office pledging transparency and accountability when it came to money management. He has moved dramatically to make that real by creating this new tripart structure with a council for the economy at the top, which has oversight, regulatory oversight over money management in the Holy See, which, by the way, for the first time, includes not just cardinals, but lay experts, as full equals, the first time in the history of the Roman Curia that there has been an organism in which cardinals and laity have equal voting rights. Beneath that is a secretariat for the economy, which does the day-to-day oversight and management, which is led by his top financial reformer, the man he relies on in this arena more than anyone else, who is a tough-as-nails Australian cardinal by the name of George Pell. Here's what you need to know about George Pell, okay? Back in the day when he was a teenager, he was an up-and-coming superstar in Australian rules football, okay? And if you know anything about Aussie football, okay, here's what to know. It's NFL-style collisions, but absolutely no pads, okay? So in a normal game, 2 or 3 guys are carted off on a stretcher. Back in the day, George Pell was the guy putting them on those stretchers. Okay, he is basically Brian Urlacher in a cassock, okay, and that's the guy the Pope has brought in, ram through reform in this sometimes truculent and often resistant old world culture of the Holy See. And then beneath that, there is an independent auditor general who keeps everybody else honest, okay. Now, these new structures have already achieved mammoth reform. Cardinal Pell has already unearthed $1.5 billion in previously undisclosed Vatican assets, okay, that were just sort of hidden away in the accounts of various dicasteries that never really, they were kind of their rainy day funds. So like people inside the shops knew the money was there, but nobody else did, and so they never appeared on the Vatican's financial statements. And later this year, he is going to be releasing the first ever consolidated financial statement for the Holy See on his watch, which I believe is for the first time in history going to provide a convincing and credible and independently certified answer to one of those questions that has long been one of the mysteries of the faith. Okay, like how many angels can you fit in the head of a pin, and how can God be 3 in 1, and all of that. These kinds of things we have traditionally said are essentially unanswerable enigmas of the faith. Well, on that list, ladies and gentlemen, has always been how much money does the Vatican actually have? Okay, and I think George Pell is going to provide us with an answer to that. That is his ambition. Okay, you asked for a reaction to the documentary. I think the documentary was right, okay, in exposing the reasons for this reform. I think it was deficient in presenting how dramatic and successful and far-sweeping that reform actually is. Okay. Oh, sorry, over here. They're both, okay, sorry.
Thanks very much for your talk.
Wait, is this the last vestigial remain of clericalism, that because somebody's wearing purple, we have to take their question?
Thanks for your talk. By my count, you mentioned the word Jesuit once this evening. It was with reference to Francis being a good Jesuit politician. so I want to give you an opportunity to make up for that deficit. How is the fact that Francis is a Jesuit making a difference for this papacy?
Well, first of all, I think Francis came into office very consciously not wanting to assemble around himself a quote-unquote Jesuit mafia. Okay, so I think he was careful at the very beginning to make sure that that relatively few of his personnel moves, and particularly at the senior levels, okay, were taken from the ranks of the society. You know, I mean, he has said himself repeatedly that you know, he feels himself now to be beholden to the entire church, not simply to his religious order. That said, I think there clearly are a couple of areas where you can see the kind of Jesuit imprint on this papacy. I think one is the fact that he came into office sort of bound and determined to try to repair the relationship between the papacy and the Vatican and consecrated life. I think one of the reasons, even though the idea of having a year dedicated, it's not his brainchild, it was presented to him, I think one of the reasons he was enthusiastic about it is because he believed it would provide him with multiple opportunities to reach out to sectors of the church that he knows very well have felt a little alienated and distant in recent years. That's probably even more powerfully felt in some sectors of women's religious, but it certainly is felt among some of the men religious as well. And however I don't think he's interested in parsing the blame for where that disconnect come from, but I think he recognizes it as a fact of life. And I think he also knows that when he goes into these settings with the religious men and women, he can speak as one of their own. He talks the language. He's a member of the tribe. He's very comfortable in those environments. So I think he sees the religious men and women of the church, both the that is both the contemplative and the apostolic dimensions of religious life, as a tremendous resource. That if this mission that he has set for the church of getting out of the sacristy and into the street, which is another one of his sound bites, right? Getting out of the sacristy and into the street, if that's to be realized, the religious have to be part of that project. And if there is a kind of breach or a gap or a cleft between the world of the religious and the authorities of the church, and particularly the Pope, then we're going to be perennially hamstrung in making that happen. So I think that's one element. The other element, I would say, is his leadership style. I mean, in many ways, I think you can analyze the way Pope Francis makes decisions as a kind of papal version of what it means to be a Jesuit superior. I mean, if you know how the ministry of a superior works in the Society of Jesus, you know that the superior has a council, okay, of sort of trusted advisors that he wants to always consult before he has to make important decisions. The Master General in Rome, the so-called Black Pope, has one. Provincial superiors have one. At every level, a Jesuit superior has a council. I don't think it's any accident that one of the very first things Pope Francis did was create what we are now calling the G9, Council of Cardinal Advisors. These 8 cardinals from around the world and 1 from the Roman Curia, who is the Cardinal Secretary of State, who are, in effect, his kitchen cabinet, his core advisors. And before he has to make an important decision of any sort, he's going to take the temperature of that body. Jesuit superiors are encouraged to consult widely, to listen aggressively, okay, to break past whatever kind of plastic bubble their office may have put them in and try to reach out to ordinary people to kind of get a sense of what's going on. And Francis does that in ways that you can't even begin to chronicle. One of his favorite is working the phone. You know, in Italy, this pope is known as the cold call pope because he is constantly calling people out of the blue, you know, who have written him or sent him a message or whatever to share some aspects of their lives with him, to talk to them. I mean, it's become so routine, okay, that there is a famous Italian comic. Okay, this guy is basically the Jon Stewart of Italy. This is the guy who does the fake news at night. He also writes a very popular newspaper column, and recently he wrote one, the headline of which was 10 etiquette tips, what to do when the Pope calls. Okay, because this has just become like an everyday, my favorite, by the way, as he said, listen, if the Pope is going on a little, if he's kind of a little long-winded that night, don't be the one to end the call, okay? You know, let him decide when it's over. And if your family is mad at you because it's dinner time, just sort of put them off. And then when you're done, walk into the dining room and say, oh, by the way, the successor of Peter and the vicar of Christ on earth says hi. So what's for dinner? You know, and that's, in a way, that's very Jesuitical. I mean, that's about trying to reach out and tap the view in the pews, so to speak. Now, the flip side of that is, however, Jesuit superiors are also, by training and inclination, at the end of the day, this is not a democracy. You know, you don't take a straw poll, you don't take a vote. At the end of the day, you have been given the charism of leadership and the charism of decision, so lead and decide. I think Pope Francis operates very much that way. I mean, I will tell you for sure, you know, whenever we know some big choice is coming down the pike, okay, like a routine thing would be, say he's got to name a new archbishop someplace, like the new Archbishop of Chicago or the new Archbishop of Madrid. Or, like, you know, on the back of this synod, he's going to have to decide what to do about divorced and remarried Catholics. Now, obviously, all of us who cover the place want to get an advance on that. We'd love to be the ones to have the story before everybody else. You know, in the old days, during the late John Paul years, it was clear who you could call, who could speak authoritatively about the mind of the Pope, and who could give you some indication of what the Pope was likely to do. We all knew who those people were, and the question was simply, were they in the mood to take your phone call at that moment in time? Similarly, during the Benedict years, we all knew who to call, and it was a name of, okay, Georg Gainswein, you know, who could speak authoritatively about what was in the mind of Benedict XVI. There is no such figure right now, okay? I mean, there is nobody to get an advance on what Pope Francis is likely to do, because he will consult widely and people can tell you the caliber of their conversations, but they will also tell you they come out of these conversations with no idea what he's actually going to do. I mean, I've sometimes jokingly said on TV that this Pope ought to come with a warning label like a pack of cigarettes that reads, caution, predictions are hazardous to your health. Okay, because you just never know. And that, in a way, is a hallmark of good Jesuit leadership. Listen widely, consult widely, take it all in. But at the end of the day, don't show your cards to anyone, because ultimately you're the one who's been called to decide. And I think that's the way Francis is leading. Underneath all of that, of course, is his profound spiritual devotion to Ignatius of Loyola, in the way that I think you know, at the core of it, he remains very much a Jesuit, but a Jesuit for the world. Is that it? Wait. Before you all scatter, just very quickly, one last thing. Listen, I want this to be the beginning of a conversation among us and not the end. That is, I don't want to just sort of parachute out of here and have no further contact with you. So let me make you this offer. If there is ever any way I can be of help to someone in this room, and honestly, no earthly idea what that might be, but you know, for those of you who are in seminary, if you're in a class sometime and there is some Vatican curiosity that comes up that you think I might be able to help with, or if you involved in parishes, if you need to do some Vatican rumor control, or, I mean, for God's sakes, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, okay, you know, this is where I truly shine. And yes, I am aware that it is a real burden of my office that so much of it is done over lengthy Italian lunches and dinners, but I want you to know I am over there carrying the cross for all of you. Okay. Whatever it is, the Crux site, which is the site of the Boston Globe dedicated to covering the Catholic Church, you can find it at www.cruxnow.com, or just Google Crux John Allen or whatever, and that will take you there. My articles are always on the site. My email address is at the bottom of those articles. I do respond to email, although if you're going to try to contact me that way, please put Saint Charles Borromeo or something in the subject line, so I don't think the 9th Nigerian prince today who's going to give me $30 million if I just give him my bank account details. But, you know, assuming you get through that spam filter, if I can be of service to you, I would be delighted to do it. Again, I want to say that I am honored to be among you here tonight. I was honored at the get-go because of the legacy of Cardinal John Foley and the ongoing pastoral leadership of Archbishop Charles Chaput. I'm honored here at the close by your intelligence and your graciousness in the way that you have made me feel welcome. Thank you. God bless you. Be well.
Perfect. And on behalf of all of us here, John, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your wise and entertaining words. And I think it would be safe to say that your mentor, Cardinal Foley, would be quite proud of you this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and have a safe ride home.